Yes, please. So, 26. Thank you.
Poor James only went missing from his mother for a matter of seconds, and he'd gone and disappeared.
Police have set up a temporary base in the shopping centre. They're warning parents that other children could be vulnerable. Hundreds of officers combed Liverpool, but James had already been dragged and pulled 2.5 miles from Bootle to Walton. Inch by inch, the police have searched the railway line where 2-year-old James Bulger's body was found yesterday.
And there must somewhere be somebody who will know the identity of the 2 boys who were seen with James.
The 2 boys are both local to this area. One is from here in Walton, the other from the neighbouring district of Norris Green.
It is horrific what has taken place.
The coroner said it was the most dreadful and shocking murder he dealt with in 25 years.
I never even killed them.
For goodness sake, keep tight hold of your children.
It was a warning heeded as parents picked up their children from school.
I've said to him that if he doesn't hold my hands, then, you know, an naughty man's going to take him and all that.
It's on your own doorstep, isn't it?
My career at that time was I was a young solicitor working on the high street in Bootle, just down Stanley Road. About 100 yards or so from the Strand. I didn't hear very much about the case in the early stages. I first became aware on the Saturday night when I was out with friends who were discussing the case, particularly because they were concerned for the safety of their young daughter who was out with us that night.
I had promised my family that I would never get involved in this case. It was an easy promise to make because there are so many criminal firms in Bootle that the chances of me ending up with this case in any event was 0, I believed. And I went to the solicitor's room, outside of which there was a phone, always ringing. Nobody ever answered it. I picked it up. I said, hello, and they said, you haven't seen Lawrence Lee, have you? And the chances of that were rather remote, considering there were 200 or 300 people around. I said, speaking. And the voice said, well, that's a bit of luck, isn't it? He said, we've got a young lad in connection with the James Bulger murder. So I said, another truant, is it? I think it may be a bit more than that, he said. Understatement of the century.
Publicity was just incessant about the case. Really difficult to deal with. It's not something I'd had any experience of before, and I really didn't expect it.
When it was first before the court in Liverpool, the first argument was it's got to be moved from Liverpool. Public feeling was so high.
Bastards!
I was a senior junior barrister who'd been in practice since 1972, so fresh by way of wounds on Merseyside that there was a concern that gathering together a jury that was going to be emotionally detached could be difficult.
In 2 separate police vans, the youngest defendants to face murder charges this century arrived at Preston Crown Court this morning. Police have spent the 9 months since James Bulger's death gathering evidence against them.
I remember arriving at the courthouse and being just amazed by the amount of technology in caravans outside for the news reports.
The press were there in their hundreds from all over the world for this case. The scene was electric, absolutely electric.
The air in the room disappeared within about 10 minutes, and it was a difficult environment to work in.
The moment that the judge, Mr. Justice Morland, ordered the boys to be brought into court,
Robert Thompson, John Venables.
It's electric as these two, I mean, they were like circus animals, came into court.
We were already sat in our positions, and then the two children came up from the cells. It brought a massive sigh from all the members of the jury. One or two shouts from the people that knew the children, and it was quite noisy for a while until the judge got them quiet. They were quite well dressed and clean, and I think it shocked all the people because I think they were expecting some scruffy little kid off the road.
There's been so much about them in the media. In my head, you know, they were kind of monsters, and probably they were like adolescents. You know, I'd pictured them as much bigger than they were. So that was the first shock when they came in. They were primary school kids. They were small.
I mean, I don't like the word surreal, but it was. That's the best way you could put it. It was surreal.
The judge asked, which of you is Robert Thompson? And Robert Thompson raised his hand. Which of you is John Venables? And Venables raised his hand. Well, I quote from part of the prosecution opening. James Bulger was 2 years and 11 months old when he died.
He was the only child
of Ralph
and Denise Bulger, and they lived in Kirby.
They always called him James, and we will refer to him as James throughout this trial. He died on Friday, the 12th of February this year.
In short, these two defendants abducted James from his mother in a shopping precinct in Bootle. James was then taken up on the railway line.
He was subjected by the two defendants to a prolonged and violent attack.
Bricks, stones, and a piece of metal
appeared to have been thrown at James on that railway line.
He sustained
many fractures
of the skull.
Death resulted in the
pathologist's words from multiple blunt force injuries to the head.
That, in a nutshell, was the case.
As far as the prosecution was concerned, they were equally complicit, and it was important that they both be found guilty.
These were two people who were in it together throughout.
The flowers in James's memory continue to mount up. A mother from Luton has sent a bouquet, and a Liverpool football fan has given a scarf which had been his father's before him. Among the messages, the question on many minds here, why?
Venables' defence was clearly, I played little part in this. You did it all.
From our point of view, we were blaming John Venables.
The defence was a cutthroat defence. One defendant blaming the other defendant.
I'm blaming you and you blame me. Literally cutting each other's throat.
It's cutthroat because it cuts both ways.
Potentially for the defence, there was an opportunity there to exonerate your own client and blame the other. Clearly, that was something that would worry the prosecution if the defence was able to push that line.
Sometimes that cutthroat defence is one that can be very, very successful.
The trial is continuing today of two 11-year-old boys accused of murdering 2-year-old James Bulger.
It was a totally surreal type of situation. I always remember the dock had to be raised by 18 inches because they were too short.
But it had the reverse effect of like putting them on show. It was like a, like a show trial. They were in the centre of the room and everyone could look at them and study them. And of course they were little boys, and one can't begin to imagine how uncomfortable that must have been.
I remember Venables a lot because he had a pretty little face, really pretty face. He looked like he was really gonna cry all the time, and he was so afraid, and a big baby, but he looked so sweet. And then the other boy, in contrast, had this really burr haircut, really shaved like he was going into the prison or something. It made him look like a tough little boy. And he sort of behaved like a tough little boy too, that sort of attitude of, oh, boy.
You felt uncomfortable watching them, but you couldn't help but watch them as well, you know, trying to see inside their minds, what had really gone on, what were they thinking. I'm sure the jury, I'm sure everyone in the court was thinking the same thing.
The first witnesses for the prosecution were brought to court from Liverpool to give their accounts of seeing the defendants in the Strand shopping centre on the day of his disappearance.
Those witnesses were emotional. We had to speak to the liaison team who were bringing them to find out if they were fit to give evidence. We had to change the order of the witnesses occasionally because we were being told that the witness was just too upset to give evidence.
There were headlines in the press, you know, the 38 who did not save little James. It was tough for them being in court. A lot of them struggled to speak, were quite inarticulate, quite upset.
For the prosecution, examining what each of the witnesses was going to say was to go towards the issue of participation, so that the jury, when they came to have to decide the crucial issue of what happened on the railway line and the lead up to it, the essence of it being that these were two people who were in it together throughout. Do you want to tell us what it was that you actually saw happen? There was these two boys with the baby, and they swung him high above their shoulders.
The boy in the black tracksuit, he let go.
And the other
whipped him up off his feet, and I shouted.
And I shouted. And what happened to the baby when he did that?
The baby was distressed, so you could see he was distressed.
And I shouted on the bus, what the hell
are those kids doing, that poor child?
Mrs. Richardson, there's always a danger when you're recollecting what happened. You may be affected by what you've read and what you've heard. Do you accept that?
I do, but this was not the case.
So does that mean there may be other things wrong in your statement?
I don't think so, sir.
Well, it's just that there's this otherwise unexplained difference between what you said now and what you said...
I'm not senile, sir, at the age of 51.
One of the things that the defence was doing with many of the witnesses was trying to work out which of the two defendants did what and which of the two defendants the witness was talking about, because each of the two boys was blaming the other and was maintaining that in their cutthroat defence.
I noticed a huge, big lump on the baby's head. So I said, you better hurry home and tell his mummy, because his head looks really sore.
Were these witnesses saying that it was one boy who was doing everything, with the other one tagging on behind, doing nothing, playing no part, showing no interest, not pushing, not carrying, not touching, not doing anything, just tagging along for the ride, which would have been something which the jury would have had to have taken into account when they decided what happened at the crucial time?
The cross-examination is often directed at just making sure that that's clear, because that's going to be part of what counsel is going to submit at the end of the case, which is that the other boy was responsible.
Every time one attacked the other, it rebounded on them. When you put the whole picture together, you could see that this was two people working together, doing the same thing, which was highly relevant in deciding what actually happened on the railway line.
always remember certain witnesses. One lady who was walking a dog.
There was a woman with a small child who said, you know, what's wrong with this little boy? Oh, he's injured, he's lost, we take him to the police station. And she worried a bit that she could intervene and should help them across the road. Should she take over?
She thinks that there's something a bit amiss, and both the two adults are encouraging the children to go to the police station to take James Bulger there. Elizabeth McCarrick wants to walk John and Robert with James across the road, and she asks the woman with the dog if she'll look after her child. And the woman says, I can't do that because my dog might not be friendly with the child.
Because the dog was jumping around, she didn't take them into the police station, but just told them where it was. And I think she felt very guilty that she never actually got them into the police station.
That was the really crucial point where things might have turned out differently. The boys moved on and continued on the route.
Today's final witness said his failure to intervene had lived with him ever since. If I'd known, I would have done something, he said. Jonathan Munro, News at 10, Preston.
I don't blame the witnesses for what happened, because the two of them knew what they were going to do, and the two of them carried us through to the end, so there's only two to blame, and that's them two. If I put myself in one of the witnesses' shoes, I'd feel the same way as they feel, because one of them had hold of James's hands, and they were that clever and conniving that, you know, she let him go. So I do feel for that woman.
If you've got me baby, just bring us back.
Mrs. Bulger isn't expected to come to court to give evidence in person, but flowers were sent to her tonight with a card which read, "From a woman in a similar situation."
It's not that I chose not to attend. I was told not to attend because the pressure would have gone to the baby, and I thought, well, I've got to think of the baby that I'm carrying as well. So not only was it grieving one, but I was thinking of another. I was just like, don't want to be going through this.
I'm not sure that I'd had the opportunity of speaking to Denise Bulger before I read her statement. There was no necessity to do so. She was not going to give evidence in court. There was nothing which the defence needed to cross-examine her about, and therefore her evidence could be read in the way we read evidence. Members of the jury, this is the statement of Denise Bulger. She made this statement on the 13th of February of this year, and she said this: I live at home with my husband, Ralph Bulger, and my son, James Patrick Bulger. James is aged 2 years, 11 months. I gave birth to him on the 16th of March, 1990. On Friday, the 12th of February, 1993, my friend Nicola Bailey, who lives with my brother. It was a long statement. It was very detailed. Nicola asked me if I wanted to go to the Strand in Bootle. I said I'd go with her. James likes to ride in Nicola's car. I agreed to go. It started with everyday matters of going to exchange some items in a shop. 4 of us walked into the Strand via Woolworths. It had children going on a ride on the Mall, we saw a seesaw in a shopping centre. James and Vanessa had a ride on it for 20 pence. And the mother lost sight of the child for a few moments, and the child was gone. I panicked. I ran out of the shop, ran to the security office, looked round. I couldn't see him. I went into Superdrug and the stationery shop, but couldn't find James. I started asking people if they'd seen him. Nobody had.
I don't think I'll be able to read that, because that, at the time, has come from my heart, and I don't know what I've written there. It's been 30 years since I've last seen this, and I just can't do it. I've described James in it, and You know, it's just, I just can't do it. Can't read it.
His brown, blonde hair, which is straight, is ready for cutting. At the moment, it's layered, his hair side parted.
I don't want to go back there because I know for a fact it'll play on my mind and, you know, it'll just destroy me. And, you know, it's took me all this time to come to terms with it. And if I read that, I'm back to day one.
She went into a lot of detail. You could probably hear a pin drop in court as it was being read out, because this was the mother who'd lost her child, and the detail mattered to people.
The scene of the two of them abducting them from the Strand is witnessed on CCTV, and therefore we can't argue that.
The evidence was overwhelming that there had been an abduction, and the only issue was whether each had participated in the offence at the material time.
The scene on the railway is not witnessed by anybody.
The key time was at the time the blows were inflicted on James, and the evidence was pretty clear that whilst there were incidents of violence along the route, the key violence, the violence that killed him, was at the railway line.
The most difficult part of the case for the defence teams was the description of the evidence from the pathologist Alan Williams, who just made it all that much more terrible and real.
I think I blotted out the memory of the injuries. Of course, one has to hear it, one has to know it, but it's distressing to think about it and remember it.
Question from Richard Henriques. At 11:20 that night, did you make a detailed post-mortem examination of the body? And do you have notes of that examination? Answer, yes. Question, and do you have those notes with you?
Yes.
Question, now, have you catalogued the several injuries that you found externally on James's body?
Yes, I've listed them in an order with numerical reference to each.
Question, you've numerically detailed these to some 42 in number. Is that correct?
Yes.
If you translate it into what actually happened, this was a ghastly, long attack of many, many blows with objects, mainly bricks.
The pathology evidence, it was just very gruelling. The jury, I think, was distressed, was upset. In any murder trial, the pathology evidence is difficult, but in this case, it was really hard to hear.
He was so small, and they were dropping things on him. It seemed to be quite an assault.
You know that a fish plate was used.
That's what killed him, the fish plate.
The judge, I suppose in his hands, it sort of gave an idea of how much it weighed and the size of it.
It looked very heavy. It was very heavy. And obviously that was the point of letting them feel it so that they understood what John Venables and Robert Thompson had done.
Question, what sort of object might cause a depressed fracture?
The classic cause is something like a hammer.
Question, might the corner of a brick cause a depressed fracture?
Yes.
Or the corner of an iron bar?
The attack was brutal. The attack resulted in death. There's no getting around it.
forensic evidence was valuable evidence for the prosecution. For the jury, that was the key time when one had to decide, was that particular defendant whose case I am considering at the moment participating, actively or passively, to commit the offence.
Today, the jury will hear from the team of forensic scientists called to investigate after the toddler's body was found on a railway line in Liverpool.
Among the evidence put to the boys included that gathered at the scene of James's death. The court heard that hair and blood samples linked the defendants with the scene of the attack.
There was the evidence of all the injuries. There was evidence of James's blood on footwear.
They did a bit of robbing, and including a Humbrol painting, which became part of the evidence.
The paint was on their clothes that they had thrown at James at the beginning of the attack.
One of the things that the defence was doing with many of the witnesses was trying to work out which of the two defendants did what. Each of the two boys was blaming the other and was maintaining that in their cutthroat defence. So I was particularly concerned when we were served with the forensic evidence that tended to indicate that Robert had played a part in the murder.
It was important evidence because Robert Thompson had continued to deny taking part in the attack.
I guess I was regarded as the go-to person for cases of that type, particularly where there are marks on bodies involved. Scene examination to an experienced forensic scientist allows him to study the distribution of evidential materials in establishing the sequence of events which took place during the incident.
The forensic evidence from Philip Ridyard was valuable evidence for the prosecution because we had a mark on a cheek and we had footwear. And the question was, what was the relationship?
Do you know that the body of James Patrick Bulger was found on a railway line, Cherry Lane in Walton?
Yes, I do.
The blood staining on John's shoes was almost unequivocal. It was a 1 in 1,000 million chance that the blood on John's shoes was not from James. The blood that was found on Robert's shoes was less convincing. There wasn't enough blood available to do the full DNA profiling. And so it was desperate that we found something else to supplement that piece of evidence. Locard was an 18th century French scientist who developed a principle on which all forensic science is based, and that is that every contact leaves a trace. Not a physical trace of something which has been deposited, but a visual trace or an identifiable trace, such as a mark. So that is how I spent most of my time looking at areas of that sort.
Were photographs taken during the post-mortem examination of the right side of James Bulger's face?
Yes, they were.
And have you examined in particular a photograph, PCR1? Yes, I have. That was my photograph. The marks on James's face were very interesting. I'll have to use some jargon, but they've been produced by a process called capillary fugation. When tissue is impacted, the blood that is just below the surface of the skin is pushed sideways. When that meets an area of less pressure, you get a hemorrhage. And those hemorrhages very faithfully reproduce the shape of the weapon or the implement which has caused this mark. And that is precisely what had happened with the marks on James's face. This is Robert Thompson's black school shoes. The construction of these shoes was, instead of having the laces running through eyelets, they ran through what are called D-rings. The degree of impact of the blow which produced the marks was sufficiently powerful to record not only the prominent D-rings, but also the laces which can be seen as chevrons running through the laces.
The evidence of Philip Rydard was effectively establishing Robert Thompson had kicked James Bulger in the face. It was a link to his participation.
The forensic evidence of the marks on James, which suggested that Robert had been part of the assault on him, was very difficult to refute. As I read evidence that is damaging, I'm also thinking of ways in which we can try and meet that evidence with other evidence or with argument.
The defense tried to present it in an alternative way, that instead of the foot coming in contact with the face had come in contact with the foot.
This is David Turner cross-examining the witness Rydard, and the question: if the head,
for example, fell on the shoe, that would be a light impact.
And the answer: the degree of
impact brought to mind by your suggestion does not immediately strike a chord with my thoughts on the matter.
He is trying to build a picture that perhaps James was lying on the floor and Robert Thompson tripped over him.
I don't know, I cringed really. It was such a desperate piece of defence.
The markings I've seen are more consistent with a dynamic occurrence rather than, for example, the shoe making contact in a light or fleeting type of situation.
We're looking at a dynamic mark here, the shoe striking at the face, which in general parlance will be described as a kick.
With respect to him, the prosecution would say it was utterly unsuccessful.
This is the one thing he couldn't get around. He had kicked James Bulger in the final attack that killed him. It felt inevitable that they were going to be found guilty, and to me the only uncertainty was whether they'd be found guilty of murder or manslaughter. Two quite different verdicts, with one a lot more lenient than the other.
They were both only just over the age of criminal responsibility a couple of months beforehand, and there could have been no prosecution in this case because of their age. They'd been under 10 when they committed this crime. The presumption that they don't know the difference between right and serious wrong is irrebuttable. It only becomes rebuttable at 10 years of age. So our first position was that Robert had the benefit of the doctrine of doli in capax.
That's a Latin expression meaning incapable of doing wrong. So between the age of 10 and 14, you are capable of committing a crime if it can be shown that you knew something you were doing was seriously wrong.
We had to establish that they would have known that to take a child away from a mother, to injure a child, to leave a child on a railway track, injured or dead, was seriously wrong and not just naughty or mischievous.
The boys were assessed. The defence teams involved psychiatrists. It potentially allowed them, by doing so, to explore whether the boys were too immature.
The only information we had about Robert's state of mind came from Robert himself and on our observations of him. We had no professional observation that could help us. So we sought the assistance of a psychologist. Eileen Vizard was instructed, and she examined Robert at the Secure Children's Home.
Dr. Vizard produced a report for Thompson's legal team. They clearly didn't want to use it because of its contents. Having become aware of the fact that she'd psychiatrically examined Thompson, we spoke to her and decided to call her as a witness ourselves.
It's an unusual turn of events when a defence witness can be appropriated by the prosecution.
Were you asked to carry out a full psychiatric assessment of the defendant, Robert Thompson?
I was.
I don't think the defence were very happy that she would appear for the prosecution. She didn't see it as a betrayal, but they felt betrayed. As far as she was concerned, she had an urgent message to get across. They may have done a terrible thing to James Bulger, but they were themselves quite damaged boys, and she wanted them to get some help. They needed urgent therapeutic attention, but there was no room for her, really, to make that argument. All she could talk about was the right-wrong issue.
Question. As to February of this year, when James Bulger died, in your opinion, on the balance of probabilities, did he know the difference between right and wrong?
In my opinion, on the balance of probabilities, he did know the difference between right and wrong.
And were you asked to examine psychiatrically the defendant John Venables? I was. In my opinion, in February 1993, he was able to distinguish between right and wrong.
I think there's all sorts of stuff in the psychiatric reports which the jury didn't see. That would have made them think a bit differently. They would have seen them within their families, within their context. They would have understood a lot of the bad stuff that was happening around them. It was inadmissible evidence. It wasn't allowed into court because a trial is just about, did they do it? Not why did they do it? In a trial like this, the interest for me and a lot of people would have been, why did they do it? But a court case isn't about the why.
That evidence, by the experts, shot it out of the water because he knew the difference in right and wrong. He was capable of crime. There is nothing that I can say that would dispute that, even 30 years on. It's clear.
I don't know if any of the evidence that I heard come out at the trial closed that question for me one way or another. There must have been a time in my life when I wasn't capable of making that distinction. But I can't remember it now, and I can't reach back to it now. It can't be assumed that that change has happened totally.
When my lads were growing up, they knew right from wrong from a very early age. So, are they that dumb at 10 that they didn't know what, taking an animal, killing an animal, taking a child, killing a child. So in their eyes, they'd done nothing wrong because they were only 10. Age doesn't matter.
The central question in the defence of many criminal cases is whether or not the defendant should give evidence in their own defence.
It was conclusive by then that the boys had taken James away from his mother, that they'd done the long walk, that they killed him. That was beyond doubt. But could the defence mount some individual case, John's side blaming Robert, Robert's side blaming John? Could they come up with something? And would the boys appear? How would it be for the boys actually to be in the dock?
You can't give evidence on just the bits you want to give evidence on. Once you're exposed to cross-examination, the prosecution can cross-examine you on the whole of the case. It would have exposed him to very difficult cross-examination.
Having him cross-examined by Richard Henriques or his junior Henry Globe would have been harrowing. So, all in all, it was decided that they wouldn't give evidence.
chose to play the interview tapes because we wanted to recreate what was happening in that interview. So the jury heard them being cross-examined by police officers. The way the boys presented themselves was really quite important.
Okay. Right, this interview's been conducted in an interview room at Walton Lane Police Station.
I think the prosecution was keen for us to see exactly the process by which the boys lied, fabricated, and eventually came around to some recognition or admission of what they'd done. It was a very, very long process. There were many hours of tapes.
No, I never went to Brutal Strand.
Okay. Now, is that the truth or a lie?
The truth.
But you do understand the importance of telling the truth, don't you?
Yeah.
He was just running around, was he, James?
Yeah.
Will you tell me exactly what, slowly, right?
John said, "Come here." And then he grabbed his hand and walked up the stand.
And he said that you took him by the hand and led him out of the Strand shops.
We never. He's a liar.
Calm down. My gosh.
Alright, it's alright. Come on, look. It's alright. Come on, alright. I never got the boy. I never killed someone.
They were drip-feeding new material to them. It was a type of cross-examination, tripping them up as they went along interview, by feeding that information to show that what had been said previously was lies.
John's told us a lot of things which are different to what you said. What happened that day? Because
we never killed him.
Well, what happened?
And it went on for hours. And the jury were listening to them.
Oh, yeah, we was, but we never saw any kids there. We never got any kids.
So you were in Bootle Strand?
Was you in Bootle Strand?
We never got a kid, Mum. We never got a
Mrs. Venables,
kid.
did you? I must ask you not to get angry with him.
I told him to take him back.
You did as well?
I told him to take him back.
You told him to take it back?
No blame.
No, you're not getting all the blame. We're just asking your son.
Sometimes raised his voice and then started this crocodile, tears, crying. That's when it was a sensitive question. Some kind of indication that he wasn't telling the whole truth.
Obviously, one of the reasons they were crying is that their defence was crumbling. But at other points, it was just the realisation, the recognition of what they'd done and that they were going to be found out for what they'd done.
We're getting there, aren't we? We're getting to the truth now.
Yeah, well, I'm going to end up getting all the blame because I've got blood on me.
We're asking you, son, and we want you to tell us the truth, that's all.
The playing of the tapes was one of the most difficult bits in the trial, I think. Not so much for Robert, but because of John, because of his hysterical reactions during his interview.
There's no point in telling lies.
I never got a kid, Mum.
Right, yourself down.
Because if I would have said I thought you would have thought I killed him.
He was there with his parents, and they were in the room, and it seemed that he was saying, you know, I can't tell you because my mum will be annoyed with me, and his mum, Susan Venables, had got upset with him at moments during the interview, so the police stopped the interviews.
Now, when that interview finished just before 1 o'clock, John Venables was then returned to what was classified as a detention room. Yes. Is that right? And a few minutes later, together with Detective Sergeant Bennett, did you take Mrs. Venables to an interview room where she was given refreshments? Yes, I did.
And they took the parents into a room and said, look, Neil and Susan, we think John wants to say more. You know, you may be inhibiting him. So if you tell him that you love him, no matter what he's done, what he says, that may help him.
Did they both embrace him? And did he then begin to cry? Yes, sir. And did he then say something that you heard? And I quote, I did kill him. That's right, my lord. And while still crying, did he say, and I quote again, what about his mum? Will you tell her I'm sorry? Yes, he did. He actually directed that comment to me.
A short while ago, you had a conversation with your mum, and you then requested that myself and Dave Tanner come into the room. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was it you told us?
That I killed James.
Right. Now, I know that took a lot of doing, and you were very upset, as we all were.
It was a very, very powerful and, really frankly distressing moment.
That was the conclusion, really, of all those long hours of tape interviews.
What was happening and how it happened came home in a way that just reading it out I don't think could have done. The jury understood the case better.
The walls of the dam had already breached. There were problems. And this was, I don't like using the expression, but it was deep doo-doo.
The defence would have been desperate for anything that might assist them at this stage, because the evidence was so overwhelming. There was a shoe print of Robert's on James's face. There was the evidence of all the injuries, evidence of James's blood on the footwear of Robert and John. There was evidence of the paint that they had stolen from the Strand that they had thrown at James at the beginning of the attack. The paint was on their clothes. They had nowhere to go. Robert Thompson's legal team came up with this pretty bold idea, like, a strategy born perhaps out of desperation.
The question was under consideration for months throughout the case. Yes, we all expressed many, many views about it on a number of occasions, but the decision's finally made in the course of the trial.
Wow. Now that comes to me as a shock.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Robert Thompson's legal team came up with this pretty bold idea, like, strategy born perhaps out of desperation, to consider whether or not Robert should give evidence.
Well, if he wanted to be believed in saying that I didn't take any part in the assault, his chances of being believed in that might be said to be better if the people who were judging him could hear him say that.
Out of the two, he was the least ruffled. He had big eyes, and he was quite a good-looking boy. And he'd be quite persuasive, I would have thought. So that would throw it right onto Venables' defence.
We were downstairs in the Preston court, not quite a cell, more of a disused room with a lockable door. Robert's barristers, myself, took him through the kind of questions that he might face and told him about how questioning would go and gave examples of that. It was quite difficult, it was quite emotional. Robert's barrister did have to go through some of the more difficult aspects of questioning that he would likely face. My feeling was that he wouldn't be able to get through the process, and a general feeling that he wouldn't give the best account of himself under cross-examination.
Yeah, well, I can understand, because he was lying. In fact, I would have thought, like he was with me in the end, if somebody accused him of lying, he'd become a rather defensive and aggressive, which probably they didn't want the jury to see.
That difficult decision was finally taken, that he shouldn't give evidence in his defence. On balance, it would have been damaging, it would have been negative, it wouldn't have helped his case, particularly in relation to the forensic evidence.
It's hard to imagine what more the defence teams could have done, because the evidence was so conclusive about the abduction and then the killing of James Bulger. Dole and Compact had also fallen apart. What could they do? That was one of the interesting things about the trial when the prosecution wound up, and we wondered what the defence would come up with. We call no defence, says David Turner for Robert. We call no defence, says Brian Walsh for John.
You know, one felt a bit sorry for them, really, because they had so little to work with. You know, all they could do was cling to this idea that they would blame the other one. You know, it wasn't me, it was him, cutthroat defence, we've told the truth, you know, it wasn't us.
It was appalling that this dear child, loved by everybody around him, died the way that James did. But Robert Thompson was not responsible for the death of James Bulger.
The conclusion of that speech is, so we may conclude this point by emphasising how few witnesses speak of Robert's active involvement. One, and only one, speaks of a hostile action. Compare and contrast that with all those witnesses who treated the close and the continuing connection between John Venable and James. Can there be any doubt who was in control? It is our sad duty to say that the evidence points, and clearly points, to John Venables.
Listening to Mr. Turner, members of the jury, he endeavoured to do what Robert Thompson endeavoured to do, namely to shift the blame for every single thing that happened onto John Venables, the boy
who told
the truth.
You may be forgiven if you had forgotten the evidence of the expert witness upon whom Mr. Turner said we should rely, who is of most importance, Mr. Ridyard, the man who looked at the shoe worn by Robert Thompson, the man who compared it with the mark on the face of James Bulger. The mark is more than just simple contact, not caused by accidental contact, in my opinion, it's by kicking. Unless the jury can specifically point to some part of the evidence which suggests that maybe one of them is less guilty than the other, they will find probably a joint enterprise situation.
I would liken this to a wall. As we were calling the evidence, we were putting bricks in the wall, and it was complete at the end of it. There were a lot of important pieces of evidence. I wouldn't necessarily say there was one brick more important than another. It was the whole wall that was being built. The prosecution closing speech, Richard Henriquez, the central question for your consideration is this: did each defendant play a part in causing the death of James Bulger?
If ever a crime was committed jointly and together, then this was that crime.
The prosecution alleged that both these defendants together committed these crimes.
When Venables led James from the precinct with Thompson,
Together, they chose to sag off school.
in the end, they were clearly both together as James sustained his terrible injuries.
Together, within the Strand, they misbehaved. Together, each one taking a hand. Together, they took James from his mother and from the Strand. Together, they took him to the canal bank. And together, they took him away across Stanley Road, away from the Strand, away from where they knew. This was abduction, we submit. Together, in its starkest form, pulled him, carried him, dragged him, injured. Together, they abused James. Thompson delivered a persuasive kick, whilst Venables chose to shake him. They were clearly both together as James sustained his terrible injuries. Could one have been committing the crime on the railway line, build a platform of bricks to effect James's destruction by a passing train? These crimes were committed together by these two defendants. It was a joint enterprise.
When the jury was out, we wanted to leave the family on their own to some extent, but we thought it's only fair that we go down and talk to them. And John was intrigued about everything to do with the QC. And he said to Brian Walsh, "Mr. Walsh," he said, "what does QC stand for?" He said, "Queen's Counsel." He says, "Have you ever met the Queen?" He said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I have." "Have you? Where?" At the Queen's garden party. Was the Queen there? Yes, of course she was there. It was her party. He said, you know, I'd love to have been there in a tree with a fishing rod, and I'd love to have caught her crown and reeled it in and taken it. And he said, young man, you have enough problems already without being charged with stealing the crown jewels.
What was I feeling before the verdict came through? I believed that we had done all that we could do for him, but I felt that it's not something that you bet on, and it's probably not the right terms to describe it. But at that time, I would have bet on a conviction, I'm afraid.
For nearly 4 weeks, she has stayed away. But this morning, for the final stages of the trial, Mrs. Denise Bulger came in person to Preston Crown Court.
I was just reeling inside that much. Apart from losing James, that's one of the hardest days of my life.
Her husband, Ralph, also returned, together with the uncles who've represented the family throughout.
The jury came back into court at 5:13. The clerk of the court said as follows: members of the jury, will the foreman please stand?
The tension was unbelievable. You could cut it with a knife.
In order to convict the boys of murder, the jury must be sure that each had known what he was doing was seriously wrong.
The judge has warned jurors not to let emotion warp their judgment.
Those 12 people had to make the decision, and they were entitled to make a factual decision which would have equaled not guilty.
I do remember getting told if I was to shout anything or say anything, I could jeopardise the case. I just needed to sit on my hands and keep my mouth shut, sort of thing, which was very hard for me to do, very hard.
Clerk of the court, charging the defendant, Robert Thompson, with a child abduction. Have you received a verdict upon which you were all agreed?
Yes.
Question: do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
In respect of the same account charging the defendant, John Venables, with child abduction, have you reached a verdict upon which you were all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find him guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
There were gasps around the court. Clerk, charging the defendant Robert Thompson with murder. Have you reached a verdict upon which you were all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find him guilty or not guilty?
I just said guilty.
Guilty.
And Thompson was sat there and he just went, and he didn't know which way to look. Lawyer, that lad, turned sideways on and looked at me and went, as if to say, you don't know what you're doing.
Clerk, finally, in respect to the defendant John Venables, have you reached a verdict upon which you were all agreed?
Yes.
Clerk, do you find him guilty or not guilty?
I said guilty.
Guilty.
He just burst into tears. So one of them was crying badly. And they were very, very shocked. Reporters, everybody flocked out, were fighting their way to get to the phone and rang the verdict through. It was worldwide.
I remember Albert Kirby, the officer who led the investigation, jumping up and going to hug Denise Bulger.
The shout from one of the uncles was, "How do you feel now, you little bastards?"
I can remember sitting a little bit further back from them, but I'm sure if it took a good few paces, I would have been able to grab one of them. But I wasn't there for that. What was I going to achieve? It would have been me locked up.
I thought about crying, you know. I felt a bit tearful.
I went downstairs immediately and met with Robert downstairs. There were a lot of tears. I think the biggest sense was that Even though the verdict wasn't what he had hoped for, I think there was also coming out of the fact that we had reached an end here. The sentencing remarks were, I suppose, brief.
Robert Thompson and John Venables. The killing of James Bulger was an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. This child was taken from his mother on a journey of over 2 miles and then on the railway
Mr. Justice Morland was the fairest judge that I'd ever come across. So there was nothing that sticks in my mind that suggests that his summing up wasn't anything other than 100% fair.
In my judgment, your conduct was both cunning and very wicked. The sentence that I pass upon you both means you will be securely detained for very, very many years.
The judge was quite severe, quite strong. I thought, oh yeah, we're looking at a very long sentence here.
What they told him was very cruel, and he said, you are going to spend very many years in prison. And from that I thought, we've got justice for him at last.
To the names of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady add Thompson and Venables. They'll spend their sentences in separate institutions. Outside the court, the women who jeered had little sympathy.
In terms of punishment, how long do you think we should be in jail for?
Life. Life. Life, and I mean life.
When the sentencing came later, people were shocked.
The very many years turned out to be less than 8 years. So I was like, there's no way. James's life was worth a lot more years than that. What they'd done was an adult crime and they should serve as adults in prison. I was disgusted in it, absolutely disgusted. My solicitor did say, if you're going to take this on, I hope you realise you're in for one long, hard battle, and I went, bring it on.
There was no way there was going to be any victories in this case. There were no winners in this case. There were never going to be any winners. The European court said it was unfair. Just say, heaven forbid, a similar crime happened again. It would never be tried in number 1 court at Preston. Number 2, cosmetically, the trial would be different.
Now we don't try children in quite the same way. We may not have had our wigs and gowns on. The children may have been sitting in the courtroom next to parents or social workers rather than in the dock.
A less formal process may have led to either one of these 2 defendants feeling like they were able to contribute to the trial and give evidence. In that old-fashioned and adult form of trial, effectively locked the 2 boys out of it. And with that, our chance of gaining those deeper understandings and those leads into questions like, why did this happen? Which I think is what everybody expected to be gone into at the trial. It's not a case you ever get the opportunity to forget about. It's a constant in my life. Yeah, it's something I probably think about most days, if not every day, on one level or another.
I had nightmares after the case for years. I couldn't get it out of my mind. And then about 10 years ago, I had a case in an adjoining court, and I just wanted to see what it was like in there. And I opened the door and it was empty. There was nobody sitting there. And I walked into court, I looked around me and I saw exactly the same gargoyles, the same furnishings, the same painting, and I burst into tears, horrified. And even now I find it moving. It was, God knows what it must have been like for kids.
He's never wavered from being well-mannered, being very polite, and appearing almost as if butter wouldn't melt.
I was told by Sky News one of the boys had been arrested on new matters. And I said, well, Thompson was always bound to be. And they said, no, it wasn't Thompson, it was your client. I mean, you could have blown me over with a feather. I was horrified.
Bulger's mother, Denise, was at the Old Bailey today to hear that Venables had extensive history of downloading child pornography.
Yet I'm still fighting justice because I strongly believe he's going to go on and do another murder like he's done James.
The length of the sentence is too short because this is reoffending and there is a pattern to this behaviour.
No matter what, I'm not going to get James back, I know that. So what I'm doing now, I'm trying to help other families who are starting off in my shoes. I know what it's like. And I don't want them to live 30 years the way I've had to deal with 30 years of fighting.
If you or someone you know has been affected by any of the issues raised in this programme, please go to channel5.com/helplines for information and support.